Thank you first of all for the kind invitation here to Leuven. I would like to share some thoughts today that arose in the context of an already mentioned research project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. And the project carries the title Dada Generation After 1945, Avant-Gardism and Modernity in Post-War Literature. And it is being conducted at the University of Zurich by Agathe Mareuge, Anja Schultes and me. If the surviving documents can be trusted, the history of the avant-garde movement Dada begins on February 5th, 1916, with the foundation of the Cabaret Voltaire at Spiegelgasse 1 by Hugo Ball, Emmy Hennings and other contributors. Initially, the Cabaret Voltaire, a room at the back of a bar, was a permanent venue for Dada events. For about half a year, numerous events took place at Spiegelgasse 1. Those were characterized by improvisation, chaos, and experiments in new forms of expression, representation, and provocation. Shortly thereafter, the movement dispersed to several other locations, first to various outposts in the city, amongst them galleries and exhibition venues, and later across the world. Tristan Tzara moved to Paris, where Dadaism mutated into the nucleus of Surrealism. Richard Hülsenbeck and Hans Richter moved to Berlin and extended Dadaism to political action art. Later, they both moved to the US. Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings stayed in Switzerland. Hans Arp and Sophie Teuber remained active in several locations: Zurich, Cologne, Paris, Strasbourg. Marcel Janko returned to Romania and eventually emigrated to Israel. Parallel to the first Dadaistic actions in Zurich, an American variety of Dada emerged in New York with Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp at its center. Further offshoots emerged in Hannover with Kurt Schwitters and in Cologne with Max Ernst. However, Dada was already international during its early days in Zurich, at least if one considers the diverse origins of the participants. A group of refugees, conscientious objectors, experimental artists, bohemians. In Dada reception research, the soirées at Cabaret Voltaire are regularly evoked. The live performances, the sound poems and simultaneous poems, the big no on stage, and the unpredictability of the performance. Altogether, it was a varied and open-ended program. Dada, so it seems, relied entirely upon the presence of the moment. This assessment is not wrong, but it falls short. For what do we know about Dada in 1916? What are we even capable of knowing about all the events and actions that happened at the time? As with every historical event, one must rely on documents, reports, testimonies, and that had to be produced and that had to be preserved so that knowledge could be transmitted to posterity. Exactly this was the case for Dada. Indeed, most testimonies of the early Dada actions came from the Dadaists themselves. That is to say, from those who have participated in those actions. This phenomenon is not merely characteristic of Dada, but of avant-garde movements overall. The originally military term of avant-garde suggests a movement that is ahead of its time. If this is the case, then it is highly probable that the initial moment of an avant-garde, often declared as such through manifestos, does not find an audience or even a historian at the time of its occurrence who is in a position to appreciate that which is happening and which perhaps does not conform to any of the known criteria. The fact that avant-garde movements attempt to break away from their respective past and also their present raises the question of how to refer back to them over the course of time, and how it can be possible that avant-garde movements develop their own forms of reception and thus also of their historicity. Should the avant-garde seek a break with the past, the question then arises how the break relates to its own potential afterlife. The question is not trivial because it truly presents a dilemma. What would an art or an anti-art be that outright eradicates the connection to a past and completely loses itself in the presence of single moments? Would not the memory of such moments already be a form of afterlife and also a form of tradition and history, even if in such a case only in a very reduced, modest and initial manner? Ultimately, there is arguably no avant-garde movement that does not involve a minimum of self-documentation, without which there can be no knowledge of it, and neither can there be any movement at all, also in the temporal sense of the extension over more than single moments. Therefore, it is no surprise that in avant-garde movements, the avant-gardists themselves often become documentarists, archivists, historians and philosophers, if you like, of their own activities. Often enough, it happens that no one else is interested in these activities at the moment of their emergence, or that they are forbidden or at least ostracized. If we turn our attention to the question of how the Dadaists themselves made Dada known, reflected on it, documented it and historicized it, it is astonishing how extensive the relevant materials are. This also gave the research project mentioned at the outset of this talk the necessary basis. For us, it was important to see that the materials do not merely stem from the years from 1916 to the advent of the Second World War. Numerous documents, memoirs, editions, exhibition catalogues, etc., were produced only after 1945. The creation of these materials even partially extends beyond the time of the so-called neo-avant-garde of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Something is conspicuous with regards to this. The period of the neo-avant-garde, which the aging Dadaists were often in direct contact with, was exactly the period when Dada first became known to a greater public. A number of reasons can be named for this delay. The first of which is simply that in the year 1916 Dada was still rather unknown. Later, in Nazi Germany, Dada remnants were considered entartete Kunst, degenerate art. A turn in reception, also an international one, began only after 1945. In particular, publications and exhibitions with the aging Dadaists themselves took co-responsibility for, ensured that Dada became known within and beyond the art world after 1945. The plausibility of this development can be validated statistically through the analysis of the frequency of the term Dada in a specific period of time in proportion to the documented vocabulary in its assumed entirety. Even though the specific databasis has to be verified critically, the basic tendency is certainly correct. The distribution frequency of the term, or better the words, Dada, as it is traced in the Google Ngram viewer, supports the determination of this basic tendency. In the German corpus, the Dada curve, if you like, rises significantly after 1950, and starting in 1970 it increases further, and after a peak in the 80s the curve flattens once more in the 90s, and I think now it should be should be going up again, but we'll see in some years. The French corpus, so it's just the second curve now, shows a similar curve. The rising of the curve occurs slightly earlier, a tendency which may be connected to the prominence of French surrealism, in the context of which Dada was constantly recalled. So this was just, I try to explain it like that, the prominence of surrealism also was the reason why Dada was recalled during these actions. In the English corpus, the basic trend is affirmed, although the trends are flatter and a new upswing can be noted starting in the 90s, which is interesting. No, this doesn't work here. Okay, it goes without saying that the naming of periods usually becomes relevant in the discourse somewhat after the fact, ex post. By means of the curve progression of the term avant-garde, taken from the English corpus, this delay can be traced particularly well. So it's not Dada now, so it's the word avant-garde. The curve, well, here you see it's even more impressive. You see how this curve goes up above 1945. The curve of the Italian avant-garde is similar. An interesting thing about this is now the Russian word avant-garde is the much earlier rise of its curve, starting in the late 1910s, so about 1970. Of course, this indicates the early political esteem of the artistic avant-garde beginning with the October Revolution. Clearly evident from the shape of the Russian curve on the left-hand side is the military origin of the word, which is even more distinctly recognizable in the French curve of the term avant-garde. Here you see in French, of course, that the military history of this term is relevant. In the German corpus, the military origin of the word avant-garde seems more or less equal in frequency to the later artistic restriction of the term. However, of particular interest here is that the curve's lowest point here of the word avant-garde is situated in those years which we traditionally perceive as the high point of the so-called historical avant-gardes. In other words, in the years after 1910, from Futurism, Expressionism and Dada through to Surrealism. Yet the rise of the curve starting about in 1960 does not mean that the respective records here, and you can click into the records if you like, refer to the then contemporary avant-garde. Upon examining the records, the clear reference to the historical avant-garde is quite evident, so they refer back to exactly this time. The rise, as well as the corresponding esteem of the early artistic avant-garde movements, is more or less analogous to the Dada curve, with, as indicated, the same upward trend in the post-war period. So normally I don't do digital humanities or things like that. It's just to show something which becomes clear also if you study the sources. In other words, this post-1945 upward trend is not unique to Dada. Unique to Dada is the strong contribution of the former Dadaists themselves to the retrospective history of their reception. If you look back on Dada today, and everything we can know about Dada, then a mountain of testimonies lies ahead of us and partakes in what Dada will have been for us. So I try to visualize that. And this now be kind of overview of some publications that have become significant in the past 100 years. On the bottom right, you can also find the reference to this one, International Dada Archive, a website of the University of Iowa with numerous digitalized original documents. This is just to show you that in the past years, the availability and accessibility of Dada documents has risen markedly through the digitalization of many documents. Here I have also inserted this black and white photograph of the exhibition Art des Kunst, Degenerate Art, organized by the National Socialists in 1937. This should emphasize that the history of Dada's reception proceeded far from seamlessly. In the course of the National Socialist propaganda and extermination policy, it experienced a profound break. And of course, you should now divide how the reception takes place in different countries all over the world, which I didn't do here. In this context, questions concerning the ideological implications arise. So the ideological implication of all these documents that were produced over the course of time. Where are the female voices, for example? What about those who died much earlier? Hugo Ball already in 1927. Of course, they could not have written anything after the war anymore. Walter Serner is killed in 1942 by the Nazis. Sophie Teuber suffocates in an accident in 1943 already. In 1948, Emmy Hennings and Kurt Schwitters die. But on the other hand, Marcel Janko did not die until 1984. Walter Mehring 1981, Hanna Höch 1978, Hans Richter and Max Ernst 1976, Richard Hülsenbeck 1974, Raoul Hausmann 1971, it was back, Marcel Duchamp 1968, Hans Arp 1966, Tristan Tzara 1963. It is also to be taken into consideration that the individual testimonies, commentaries, reflections, performances, publications and exhibitions of the aging Dadaists are very heterogeneous contributions. So this would just be a picture of this heterogeneous group of people. And here again, women are excluded because there already is no film material. Also, this woman in the center now, you don't see it, it's just the interview. Marcel Duchamp. Not all of them speak at the same volume. They do not assent to the same appraisals. Some of them even seem to purposefully pursue contradictions to themselves, an inconsistency that can perhaps, in the spirit of Dada, be openly affirmed. Thus we read at the very beginning of the contribution, or one article by Marcel Janko entitled Schöpferische Dada, Creative Dada, in a Dada anthology from 1958. So this is Janko writing this article. Ein Dada wird niemals Memoiren schreiben. Dada will never write his or her memoirs. But what follows in this article is exactly this, a clearly recognizable form of memoir literature. The most beautiful sentence is to be found at the end of the same article by Janko. He writes, Dada besteht und wird so lange bestehen, wie der Geist der Verneinung das Ferment der Zukunft in sich schließt. Dada exists and will exist as long as the spirit of negation encompasses the ferment of the future. Janko belongs to the few who explicitly emphasize such a transactual dimension of Dada. He thus highlights the fact that Dada does not have to be conceived as an epoch or period, spanning from the first half of 1916 at a minimum and in a slightly more generous chronology, including the years from 1960 to 1924, that is until the publication of the first Surrealist Manifesto by Henri Breton. In his Chronique Zurichoise, Tristan Tzara proposes an alternative temporal definition of Dada 1915, you can see it to 1919. Georges Hunier in turn refers to the years 1960 to 1922. Janko, however, does not limit Dada to a single period of time, but rather attempts to conceive Dada as a principle of a productive negation across time. As such, it consequently does not merely reach into the future, but is also able to declare figures like Rimbaud or Nietzsche Dadaists avant la lettre. In that moment, Janko does not merely assert a dimension of Dada across time, he simultaneously collaborates performatively in the validation of the plausibility of such a dimension by composing a piece of writing that all at once recalls and continues the Dada project. Indeed, various protagonists use the term Dada quite differently. In the end, Dada is just a word. It can be given various meanings. This potential for admitting of even completely contradictory meanings characterizes Dada, however. While some Dadaists use the word as a way of defining a historically determined moment, others connect Dada with the spirit which wanders mischievously across all periods or different periods of time and history. Hans or Jean Arp even defined Dada as an absence of sense, ohne Sinn, and not merely as nonsense, Unsinn. This absence of sense underlies all possible attempts of interpretation. Hence, Arp was able to assert in a conversation with the Zurich television journalist and writer Peter Carverli, still living, alles ist eine Reaktion auf Dada. So that was Harp saying this sentence to Verli. Everything is a reaction to Dada. Everything is a reaction to Dada. A thought that, despite or even precisely because of its immoderation, deserves closer examination. The thought allows us to conceive of the specific answers, references, and after effects of Dada, or respectively of this absence of sense itself as this decisive, probably decisive legacy of the historical Dada movement. How can one remain loyal to a movement through treason? Or how can one become disloyal to what seems to be guaranteed? These questions might come closest, perhaps, to the spirit of Dada. Seen from this perspective, post-historicity does not appear as an inevitable period of decline of a previous original attitude, but as a chance of every present to invent itself anew and to bid goodbye to traditional forms of articulation and perhaps of behavior. If the thought is taken seriously that from its outset the point of Dada was its belated stimulation force, one of the most renowned theories of the avant-garde, the one formulated by Peter Bürger in 1974, collapses like a house of cards. About this more needs to be said. Peter Bürger started from two strong premises. With regard to the actual interventions of the avant-gardes, and especially of Dada, in the spheres of art and politics, these premises proved to be problematic. Well, I'm not the first one who observes that, but I just want to recall that. Bürger firstly assumed that the avant-gardes, and most radically Dada, opposed art as an institution. For Bürger, the term institution refers to what he conceives as bourgeois conditions of production and reception of art, above all in the 19th century, during which art became increasingly detached from practical relations and questions. According to Bürger, the avant-gardes made visible the division between life and art. With the dissolution of art into life, the overcoming of their division is concurrently pursued. Bürger declares this process as finally a failure. However, it is reasonable to assume, together with Jacques Rancière, who proposed that the dissolution of the division between life and art has been achieved only too well in large areas of life in the late 20th and early 21st century. This has been so successful that we do not even notice to what extent we have become part of an aesthetic regime, as Rancière puts it, within which Dada is also included, for better or worse. In his diagnosis, Bürger overlooks the fact that while the avant-gardes did attack some forms of art as institution, or at least rejected them, they concurrently worked on the experimental testing of new forms of institutionalization or of proto-institutionalization through publications, exhibitions, and the like. The avant-gardes often denied this circumstance, but they were inseparable from it. I will attempt to substantiate this further in the following, taking Dada as an example. At any rate, institutionalization cannot simply be conceived of as a deplorable process, which, according to Bürger, only began with the neo-avant-gardes he critically examined. In fact, institutionalization, in its recognizable beginnings at least, played an important role from the very start. A second premise problematically defines Bürger's line of argument. It is a direct result of the temporal model with which the Théorie der Avantgarde, theory of the avant-garde, operates. With explicit reference to Marx, Bürger starts from the premise that history, including the history of art, is forward-directed and that the avant-garde specifically only refer to the past through their negative or negative dialectical break with it. This diagnosis is not completely wrong, but it disregards the improbability of an avant-garde movement that does not include, in addition to its present moment or to its impulse directed to the future, another momentum. This other momentum refers back to and aims at its own transmission. For instance, it is evident that for the genre of the manifesto, the act of proclamation directed towards the future is decisive. However, every form of publication of the manifesto simultaneously leaves behind a trace leading to the past and to the future past. This implicit and often also explicit backwards pointing reference, this latent or manifest archival function, has still not been investigated much, at least I think so, in avant-garde research. This is related to its frequent contradiction by explicit statements in avant-garde manifestos or by respective actors against any form of museumization, conservation, or classification into a specific discourse or into a certain form of institutionalization. Only what is said and what is effectively done do not need to coincide. Thus, theorists like Peter Bürger overlooked the contradictions between the explicit demands formulated by the avant-garde movements and the respective contemporary practice. It is not surprising that the history of decline then is the result. Yeah. Misleading in a model of an avant-garde conceived as a pure origin, after which its own demands must fail, in the assumption that there ever was such purity. Just as misleading is the assumption that the process of a gradual institutionalization and diffusing of avant-garde impulses is exclusively historically much later after effect. In his groundbreaking, or I think at least it's still groundbreaking essay, What is Neo about the Neo-Avant-Garde from 1994, Hal Foster demonstrates that it was precisely the so-called neo-avant-gardes who subsequently grasped the relevant aspects of the so-called historical avant-gardes. After 1945, the further question was raised which artistic projects or one could still relate back to in an affirmative manner after the catastrophic experiences of the war. In a nutshell, without the neo-avant-gardes, we would know hardly anything about the avant-gardes. Without the neo-avant-gardes and their successive projects, the unrelenting irritation over the avant-gardes would not be appreciated as persistently to this day. This perspective is sustained through the course of the curves we just have seen in the beginning of the talk. What Foster hardly considers, however, is that it was often the aging avant-gardists themselves who contributed to this retrospective esteem. So that is just not something Alf Foster is dealing with, but at least to me it is important. And the process of self-historicization, self-archiving, self-commentating, and above all self-production already begins much earlier. So that was kind of an insight we gained with some delay also in our project, because we thought it starts all after 1945, but of course it starts earlier. So I also want to talk about this early afterlife of Dada, beginning in the moment, let's say, of its foundation, also in the initial moments. In my opinion, a contemporary theory of the avant-garde would take these moments of self-reference, self-presentation, and also this moment of referring back into account in their specific temporality. This is a task I cannot accomplish today, but that seems worthwhile to me. What I would like to present to you in the second part of my talk today are, on the one hand, early forms of self-historization in the context of Dada from the years, let's say, 1916 to 1927, and then, on the other hand, later forms of Dada reproduction after 1945. Let us begin with one of the earliest records of Dada in Zurich, the revue Cabaret Voltaire from May 15th, 1916. We recall, just a few weeks have passed since the Artist Tavern of the same name, Cabaret Voltaire, was founded, and there is already a first retrospection of what happened at that time. What kind of artistic contributions were made, and which of these contributions would perhaps become meaningful in the future. Already in the first contribution to the review, we read how Hugo Ball immodestly provides details of what he wished to achieve with the foundation of the Cabaret Voltaire, who joined when, how the press was involved, what happened, and where all this was expected to lead. So you can read this here if you like. Already the first clause reads like the foundation of an institution. Als ich das Cabaret Voltaire gründete, when I founded the Cabaret Voltaire, and so on. Even the link to history, at least the most recent one, is not suppressed in the review, but emphasized almost aggressively. Italian futurism is represented by a contribution by Marinetti, Cubist graphics by Picasso, so this is what the content of this magazine or review. Expressionist poetry by Jakob van Hodis and Kandinsky, interesting, didn't know that before. Furthermore, next to other strictly Dadaist contribution, it also includes a poem by Apollinaire. In 1916, these names or art forms were already quite known, at least in this circle, and Dada did not set itself up in opposition to them from the outset. Is it too bold to assert that the first Dada publication already worked at its own inscription into art history? Included in this is also Hugo Ball's very early declaration of Dada's end. However, in his autobiographical text, Die Flucht aus der Zeit, The Flight Out of Time, published in 1927, he, Hugo Ball, did not hesitate to give an impression of the Dada soirees and to underscore the overall importance of Dada. What would be the legitimation of asserting that all these documents are not true Dada testimonies? What do we even know about Dada if we do not know it from these kinds of records? By no means do I want to imply that the transmitted documents all record the truth. For that, they are luckily too contradictory. But I would, it would in short just be a mistake, I think, to overlook or hide the intricate connections between life moments, documents, reflections, persiflage reports, publications, performances, and manifestos in their specific interactions. Tristan Tzara and Richard Hülsenberg also wrote their first chronicles, reports, and reflections on Dada at an early stage. In part, the recording occurred almost simultaneously to the described events. In early Dada self-reception and production, Tzara and Hülsenberg do indeed adopt a prominent position. This contributes to their ability to export later Dada to Paris or Berlin. History is already being stirred up here. Already in Zurich, Tzara begins to publish the Dada magazine, so the magazine with the title Dada. In the first issue from July 1917, Marcel Janko's address is indicated. In the second issue from December 1917, an F.R. is indicated, presumably the brother of Jean-Arc François Arp. And from the third issue onwards, Tzara takes charge. He is included already before then, but then you can see his name. Then here is, so to speak, the chief editor of this magazine. Shortly thereafter, he relocates to Paris with the magazine, so he took it along. In the meantime, and also subsequently, Richard Hülsenberg does not tire of producing a whole series of Dada publications with documentary characteristics. Here you can see the cover of Hülsenberg's Dada almanac from 1920. This almanac also includes the Chronique Zurichoise by Tzara, and in a German translation. In the same year, the publication, this one, En avant Dada, eine Geschichte des Dadaismus, a history of Dadaism, and a third one, Dada siegt, Dada's victorious, were released. So this is 1920, quite early. And in 1927, Hülsenberg published the article Wozu war Dada da? Why was Dada here or there? What is at stake is clearly stated at the very beginning of this article, and I read this, well, in the English translation it would read a retrospective view of a movement that has now become historical already 10 years after. Why was it necessary? What remains? What did Dadaism achieve? Is it possible to describe more eloquently how an avant-garde movement became historical? The magazines and publications themselves unfold a kind of performance, a publication performance which oscillates between serious reporting and, well, this is a thing that should be investigated more, I think, Dadaist interventions, because they are, of course, this is not just historiographical material, but it is also, we should show that in detail and kind of artistic performance, these articles. Concerning the latter, Marcel Duchamp was probably the most ingenious player in the field of art production and simultaneously in the reconsideration of what could or should be considered art or not. Even if the attribution of Duchamp to Dada is less evident than that of Ball, Tzara or Hülsenberg, New York Dada is still the keyword Duchamp occasionally used to refer to his own actions and works. The media campaign, this is how I would like to refer to it, through which Duchamp made known his infamous ready-made fountain is revealing for our interest in the afterlife of Dada within its initial historical moments. This incident went down in history as the Richard Mutt case. First of all, the customary narrative. Marcel Duchamp submits a urinal to the April 1917 exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in New York. He assumes the pseudonym R. Mutt and wishes to see the urinal exhibited as a piece of art. Although any kind of object should be permitted to the exhibition to be exhibited at this exhibition for a contribution of $6, this object was finally rejected. This led to a scandal. Later, the urinal entitled Fountain, Duchamp's most famous ready-made, became world famous. Fountain is considered the Mona Lisa of Dadaism and is today often regarded as the most important work of art of the 20th century. Well, what is true about this story? True about it is chiefly that Duchamp himself circulated this story. Duchamp used the second and last issue of the magazine The Blind Man to declare in May 1917 the entire affair a sensational case, the Richard Mutt case. Even if the authorship remains, or still remains, obscure, it is reasonable to assume that Duchamp himself wrote the article. He most likely also participated in the production of the other replicated or fictitious articles on the case in the magazine. Now I'd like to read out just this short article here on the right-hand side. They say any artist paying $6 may exhibit. Mr. Richard Mutt sent in a fountain. Without discussion, this article disappeared and was never exhibited. What were the grounds for refusing Mr. Mutt's fountain? First, some contend it was immoral, vulgar. Second, others, it was plagiarism, a plain piece of planking. Now Mr. Mutt's fountain is not immoral. That is absurd. No more than a bathtub is immoral. It is a fixture that you see every day in Plum's shows. Whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under a new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object. As for plumbing, that is absurd. The only works of art America has given are no plumbing and no bridges. The remark in capital letters that Mr. Mutt chose the object, that he took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under a new time and point of view, created a new thought for that object, corresponds minutely with the definition of the ready-made Duchamp reuses elsewhere and quite often. Besides the article Dada of the bathroom, the magazine includes the possibly fictitious report of a mother who is incensed by the alleged decline of moral standards in the exhibition. The one photograph taken by Alfred Stieglitz and published in the respective issue of The Blind Man is ever since the only visual document of the fountain. The original, if it makes any sense at all to talk about the original here, the original of the urinal vanished. One of the most famous artworks of the 20th century has not existed materially for a long time now. Those fountains exhibited in museums today are replicas throughout, also the one you saw before in the picture, the photograph with Duchamp, all replicas. And everything we know about the fountain ultimately originates from Duchamp himself and of course of his friends and a whole network working on these stories and myths. In other words, there was no straightforward scandal succeeded by an ordinary article of life being turned into a famous work of art. On the contrary, the Richard Mutt case, from and essentially, sorry. I just skipped the line. On the contrary, the fountain is a retrospective narrative from the outset. By means of these contributions to the magazines, The Blind Man, an entire reception situation was invented in order to produce this Richard Mudd case. The case thus had to be constructed. The fact that the material object vanished afterwards, that it was probably discarded, is ample evidence that this kind of art, as an early form of conceptual art, relied on completely new forms of event production. The self-documentation is a self-production in this case, and it is indeed a self-documentation so productive in its after effects that it must be considered the actual artistic event. Without the magazine and without the numerous other statements on the case, Duchamp himself made subsequently, there would be no proper incident at all. In fact, the incident develops exclusively or more or less exclusively from the later stories told about it. I emphasize this to make it very clear that these temporal dislocations cannot be grasped with such a theory of the avant-garde as the one Peter Bürger, for instance, has framed. In the worst case, one is deceived by the initial inventions and myths. Those were employed strategically by the avant-gardists and must be understood and taken seriously in their formation and structure. Also in his later years, Duchamp famously made the often quite idiosyncratic retrospection of his work an integral part of his art or non-art. Instances of this are, you probably know this, the Green Box of 1934 or the box in Valise, which is a miniature museum of his most important works so far. In his talk, The Creative Act from 1957, this was the box in Valise, and in his talk, The Creative Act from 1957, Duchamp made a statement about this practice. It is always posterity that defines something as a work of art, he stated. However, with this assertion, Duchamp hid that he himself created his works throughout from the perspective of posterity. Accordingly, he designed his works from the perspective of reception all along. And this starts already with the ready-mades because they're kind of, they are receptive, if you like, from already from a standpoint not of production but of reception. Much more. It is this perspective we should not forget, I think, in the analysis of the Dada testimonies. Some documents may have euphemistic or idealistic characteristics, or may be designed to pettily accord right away to their own position of relations in relation to others, etc. Or may be designed to, of course there were disagreements between Dadaists who first invented or at least made known simultaneous poems, now we see the old man, again, or the technique of photocollage, and yes, there was even some disagreement about the origins of the word Dada. If one brings to mind the numerous documents, many of which were created only after 1945, then these aspects are, these are things so quite marginal and they are comparatively uninteresting. Much more telling, also for the overall time span after 1945, is the inquiry into how the aging avant-gardists, and among them especially the Dadaists, contributed to the enrichment of post-war art and literature, and thus built a bridge to a trans-actual and trans-epochal modernity. My associate and colleague Agathe Mareuge at the Sorbonne in Paris is currently researching the connections and sometimes even cooperations that emerged in the 60s and 70s between the works of members of aging avant-garde with the younger generation of neo-avant-gardes. So if you wish to hear more about that, you would have to invite Agathe. To obtain an overview of the phenomenon Dada after 1945, one has to take into consideration the worldwide post-war exhibitions. Former Dadaists often contributed to these shows. A series of films is also worth noting, such as Hans Richter's Dadascope from 1961. This is behind this small Particularly relevant, however, are the publications accrued after 1945. So I have about, it's only 4 pages I have, so is it okay if I just go on with the talking and then we have the discussion?
It's fine by me.
So because the first person already left the room, so... So it's about, let's say, 10 or 12 minutes, okay?
I will leave at 5.
You need to go at 5. Okay.
Maybe you can just summarize it.
Okay, I can do that. So, yeah, I just would have shown you some picture of publications that then were produced in this time after 1945. And this would have been probably a nice example of how one Dadaist, in this case Hans Au, made a kind of collage between a poem he wrote in 1917 and a poem he wrote in 1945, which is based exactly on the words on the poem of 1917, which he interpolated with new words. So here you can see that you have the reference, the clear reference to a Dada poem. That would be the one on the right-hand side you have here, and here on the left-hand side you have kind of explanation of it. And then you can see how he works with these words. So I have here on the left-hand side the new poem of 1945, and on the right-hand side you see the poem of 1917, and you see which words he grasps from the right-hand side and how he forms a new poem on the left-hand side, more or less 30 years later, and he also comments on that process. So that would be an example of how this relation or this reference back to the Dada can take place, and it also fits to this remark we already had before, that all or everything is a reaction to Dada, as Arp puts it. So then now I'm already finished, so I can think and try to find where I could or should be. Well, what is interesting, at least to me, at this sentence is this word reaction, because reaction, of course, is not a word that with very good association. So we could ask, what can reaction mean? So here, if you take this word reaction and relate it to this example with 2 poems, then you can see this is a form of reaction to what was 1917, which opens up a quite dislocated time frame. And the question arises, so what can react mean here? And I would suggest to ask what could be a reaction that encounters or refers to something that is completely unknown or fundamentally incomprehensible. Then perhaps we have an interesting form of reaction that takes place. Something that exists but that complicates or renders it impossible to form an opinion. Are there not enough spheres in everyday life, in science and in art, where these questions arise? Forms of reaction where we don't know exactly to what we really react to. A Dada-sophy would be a fitting discipline, perhaps, for the posing of such questions and for forming a response to them, in a spirit of an experimental reaction to the without sense, as art supposes. So that's not what I can do today. So to conclude, I only want to raise the question of what Dada could mean today. If one suggests that today it is no longer possible to produce Dada art, so and some people say so, then one suggests knowledge of the nature of Dada. But who wants to possess that knowledge in earnest? Is Dada still interesting if the word is used as a simple label of a period of art history? The examples I've presented to you today seem to me to suggest the possibility of a more interesting understanding of Dada. Dada after Dada, that is to say, the present moment is always uncertain, already gone or not yet here. But one can attempt to seize everything that happens, and especially if it escapes one's grasp. And from this backwards pointing reference, perhaps grasping at nothing or following completely unknown patterns, something can begin. So this is the time of relation which I'm interested in. Trying to grasp something that escapes. And the way we do, or one does this, is of course also opening a time frame towards the future. This movement seems to be at least interesting to me. One can recognize it in Hugo Ball's founding and already retrospective gesture, or in Marcel Janco's reminiscent speech on the ferment of the future, in Richard Hülsenberg's meticulous work on memory, which is simultaneously a document of his far-sighted social and psychoanalytic interests, or in Marcel Duchamp's projective recollection of that which already will one day have been, or finally in art's retroactive opening of a crazy poetic time frame. These movements are also Dada, and therefore movements capable of provoking a reaction to Dada time and again. Thanks for your attention.